Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Hello everyone, it's Jesse Green here. Welcome back to SavvyDentist.com and to the Savvy Dentist podcast. It is fantastic to have you here for another episode of the show. Now, if you're new to our podcast, welcome. If you've been back here a few times, great to have you back. And if you've not yet grabbed a copy of our free report about how to build a high-performance dental practice, can I encourage you to go and grab it? It's yours free as a gift for listening to this podcast. All you need to do is get across to savvydentist.com/high-performance-report. You can grab that report and it'll show you some of the key things to focus on as you take your practice to the next level. Now, as you grow your practice, your ability to lead your team is going to be critical. And my guest today, Pearse, is an expert when it comes to leadership. He's the author of a wonderful book called The Broken CEO. And what he's really passionate about is helping leaders become the leaders they've always wanted to be, the people that they really aspire to be. And we had a really wonderful conversation. We spoke about a lot of different things, actually. We spoke about what leadership is and what it isn't, the balance between leadership and management, and when one's pushing and one's pulling. We spoke about the mindset, and we spoke about the particular word mindset, but the mindset one adopts when you're moving from leadership to management, and the need to be flexible in your approach to leadership and the different types of primary methods of leadership that each of us have that we've got to be mindful of, and we've got to be able to know when to shift gear and do something else. So again, a wide-ranging, far-reaching conversation. Chris was really generous with his time. He got up at close to midnight to do this interview in the UK, and there's so many pearls of wisdom in here that I'm going to ask you to listen to this episode 2, 3, 4 times, because I know that every time you listen to this, you're going to get a lot of value from Chris. So without any further ado, here's Pearse. Pearse, welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast. It is wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us at an ungodly hour from the United Kingdom. How are you all the way from over there?
Very well and wide awake, thanks, Jesse.
Well, as we were saying off air, just for reference, ladies and gents who are tuning in, it is probably 4 past midnight in the UK or thereabouts at the moment, and it's 4 past 11 a.m. here. So firstly, I want to say thank you for making the time at this hour. And I don't know how many cups of coffee you've had, but you are bright and alert, and obviously, you've got a lot of stamina.
I hope it lasts.
Chris, we're going to be talking all about leadership, and clearly this is an area for which you're most well known. You've written a book called The Broken CEO, How to Be the Leader You've Always Wanted to Be. You're well known in terms of mentoring large organizations as well as medium and small size enterprises when it comes to becoming more effective in leadership. What I really wanted to start our conversation with is to actually talk about what leadership is or isn't, because what I've found in the past is anytime leadership comes up as a topic of conversation, there's assumptions, and I wonder if there's misconceptions about leadership or things that we assume or think that may be true or may not be true. And so I really wanted to start this conversation by asking you, how do you define leadership? And then following on from that, what common misconceptions do you see or do you hear being bandied around when it comes to the topic of leadership?
Yeah, there are so many definitions of it. I don't particularly like hard definitions, but I think a useful way of looking at leadership is the business of inspiring people to do things they didn't think were possible, with the proviso of good things they didn't think were possible. I think if you look at it like that, it makes sense because it's another dimension away from pure management. Now, management is, it's absolutely necessary in any enterprise, but it's not sufficient on its own. And leadership provides that extra inspiration, I suppose, that scope for going to new places, doing new things, building new visions that management doesn't have.
Okay, so that's a really good way of looking at it. When you talk with people, work with people, do you find that there's misconceptions or misunderstandings? What are the common, myths or perhaps maybe not myths, but where do you see people having an idea about leadership and what it may be where it's not helpful?
Yeah. Well, I think the most common one is that leadership is about telling people what to do. And that has its place. You know, if you're a fire chief and you're putting out a fire, you're not going to hold a meeting to discuss how people might like to approach the matter at hand. But generally speaking, in an enterprise, you're not in crisis mode all the time, or at least you shouldn't be in crisis mode all the time. So I think that's one misconception. Another critical misconception is that leaders don't understand the power of their own influence and the influence that they have, not so much through their words, but through their actions. Because the way that the leader behaves is the single most important influencer in terms of the culture of the organization. And so often, and in fact, a lot of it's coming out now in the press at the moment, there are many organizations, including governmental organizations, where the leader or the leadership is saying one thing of undermining the organizational culture and creating toxicity that I know of. If you're up to date with the UK press, you'll have seen a lot of criticism of the fact that during the lockdown, government passed various laws that they did not keep to themselves. And that's a very blatant example. It happens in a much more subtle way, though. Just in the way that people behave with one another, leaders need to be very careful about their own behavior. That's certainly a tripwire for budding leaders.
So just on leadership behaviours for a second, because I think it's an interesting topic, and obviously we heard about those news stories over here in Australia as well. We're well aware of that particular situation. Are there particular leadership behaviours, or is it more about congruity with what you're saying and what you're doing? Or is there particular behaviours that perhaps better leaders, more insightful leaders display routinely? I'm just curious to ask whether it's a matter of congruence or whether it's a matter of a particular behaviour set.
That's a great question. It's both. There has to be congruence, but in terms of the behaviour itself, it is very, very helpful for leaders to maintain a calm, centred, rational and responsive demeanour, as opposed to a reactive one. And this is something a lot of my clients have difficulty with, because they are in situations of pressure, of stress, of conflict, of being in situations that are suboptimal, if you like. When those can become overwhelming, and when they do, it's very easy to snap into a kind of a reactive mode where you're barking orders, you're externalizing your emotional world for everyone to see. And then essentially that's telling people that that's giving people free rein to copy your behavior.
Yeah.
So I think it's very, very important that the leader, whoever that is able to maintain a degree of decorum, a calm, studied, almost stoic. This doesn't mean that they're cold or indifferent, quite the opposite, but it means that they are not being pushed around by their emotions, that they are in charge of their emotional ground.
That's a really, really, really interesting topic, because I'd just like to take a moment to explore that and whether that can be cultivated, and if it can be cultivated, how so? Because it's really interesting. I was talking to a client of mine the other day, and he has a high degree of self-awareness, and he's very mindful of how he interacts with people. But he'd been going through a particularly difficult and stressful time, and he felt that he'd been perhaps more reactive and more, I guess, being pushed around by his emotions perhaps. But he made a comment, and I thought this is a really interesting comment. He said, "The greatest risk to my business is me."
Yes.
And I thought that was a really insightful comment. I thought, that took a degree of self-awareness. It took a degree of knowing the impact of those behaviours. But then as we worked through things, it was about how do we get him back to being more centred, more grounded. And of course, I can't help but think of the great British expression, which is keep calm and carry on. How does one cultivate that sense of stoicism?
It's very easy in trying to emulate or display that kind of behaviour to end up, rather than rising above the emotions, to start repressing them. or suppressing them.
Yeah.
You know? And that is absolutely not helpful. It's helpful to think in terms of feeling your emotions, absolutely feeling them and being very much connected with them, but without necessarily externalizing them and seeing them. You are not what you're feeling. Now, as soon as you realize that you are not what you're feeling, you put a slight distance between yourself, your sense of I am, your observing conscious self, and the phenomena that you're experiencing, your emotions. And when you put that distance, you start to objectify them, and then you are no longer quite as deeply entrenched in them as you might be otherwise. That's a practice, that a skill that is absolutely learnable, teachable, and it's something that I, as a matter of course, train my clients in. And the first step towards doing that is understanding the very, very basic mechanics of mind that are simply not taught, I don't think, anywhere else. They're certainly not taught in school, unfortunately. I think a lot of the modern mindfulness movement and some of the very ancient systems of thought and philosophy absolutely knew all about them. And those traditions are coming to the fore. That knowledge and wisdom is coming to the fore more now than ever. But still, a lot of people are not familiar with them. And that is the first step to be gaining a little bit of control over that kind of reactive behavior.
I really appreciate that, because again, in my own life, I've experienced that sensation of being carried away by my emotions. But I've also practiced mindfulness as well, and I really resonate with the idea of just trying to notice your thoughts and, I notice that I'm having this emotion, or I notice I'm having this feeling or thought or whatever, and trying to put that distance there. And, I'm human like everyone else. I have degrees of success with that, and some days that degree is greater than others. So I wanted to ask about, for leaders who are listening to this podcast going, that makes perfect sense to me, Chris. I get that. But there are times when, I need to find my own, dare I say, safe space. And I don't like using that word safe space because it feels a little bit new age and a little bit politically correct. But a place where I can actually, as you say, express those emotions rather than suppress them, and acknowledge the fact that I'm feeling annoyed, upset, angry, whatever it happens to be, but in a way that's not going to be damaging to those around me. So do you have any thoughts about, when leaders feel themselves getting riled up or feeling agitated, how do they express that if they've got something really going on, without kind of creating collateral damage for the team? Yeah,
sure. Well, very often in those kinds of situations, something needs to be done. I'm not for a moment advocating that you just keep stum and bottle everything up and don't do anything. Things need to be said. And sometimes it's appropriate that you impart your message with emotion. The difference is, though, that you are doing the emotion. It's not the emotion that's doing you.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Got it.
In terms of externalizing, expressing it, it needs to come under your control. It has to be at your discretion. If there's any sense that you're being carried away on a wave of emotion, certainly in a leadership position, in fact, I think in any position, that's probably not helpful.
As someone who has had some experience with that, when I was in the Navy, I remember I was a dentist in the Navy, and we'd had the hierarchical leadership structures, which you said earlier, when there's a fire, you need to be able to direct someone. But we also had some leaders who, because they had more stripes on their shoulders than the rest of us, they were in those positions of leadership. And there were times when some of those emotions got the better of people, and it did create a sense of, oh my God, what's going on here? And unfortunately for that particular leader, it undermined their credibility and their authority in spite of their rank. And so they might have had the rank, but they didn't have the leadership to go with it. So I can see how that would come unstuck. I wanted to ask you about leadership and management. We had a conversation just before we hit record, which I think was one of the most elegant descriptions of leadership and management and why both are necessary. And I was wondering if we could talk about your metaphor of creating pottery when it comes to leadership and management.
Sure, I'd love to. I think the basis of it is that leadership and management are in a relationship, if you like. It's not that one is good or one is bad, or that you move from management into leadership and abandon management. So I think the first principle is that any good leader will be managing and any good manager will be leading to a degree. So the metaphor is simply this. If you take, as many of us have done, you take a lump of clay and you throw it on a potter's wheel, spinning, and you put one hand inside the blob of clay and the other hand on the outside, and the two hands work together to create ultimately a pot, at least if you're any good. Now, the inner hand is very gently pushing outwards to take the clay beyond the limits of where it was. The outer hand is restraining and resisting that motion, so that the two, the inner hand and the outer hand, are in balance. And when you get the balance right, it's a dynamic balance, of course, it's not a static balance, but when you get that balance right, you can make beautiful things. And the metaphor is simply that the inner hand pushing out is leadership, and the outer hand constraining and restraining is management. And that's very much how they work in an organization or in a team.
I'm curious to ask about that relationship and you know, as you said, the inner hand is gently pushing out and the outer hand is constraining that in a really positive way. How do you know how much pressure to apply in either direction?
Yes, all metaphors have a limit, of course.
Of course, and I understand that. But it's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because
great question. No, it's a question that has to be answered. The balance between the two, ultimately, in my experience, is found through one's intuition. Mm. It's not a logical, rational process. And just as you are feeling things with your hand, so you will be feeling with your other senses and faculties the right balance required in any situation. So, for instance, if you are speaking to an individual, that balance will be particular to the individual you're talking to. If you don't know the individual, then you're going to have to test the limits.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I had a couple of years ago, I had a stint as an interim MD running a small business just for a few months on behalf of the owners. And I had a technical director who was not responding. And I initially tried my kind of go-to style is collaborative and democratic and, you know, all of that. So I went through the issues with him and there was no change. So I immediately, within a few days, realized nothing was happening, and I moved to an autocratic style of leadership and essentially said to him that if he didn't change, his days were numbered, which is it's not a comfortable thing for me to do, but I knew that that's what had to be done. I could feel that intuition that it had to be put in those terms, and it worked. That there was an immediate shift in performance. That balance between management and leadership, it's a very intuitive thing. And I think anyone that's been in a position of leadership at any level will have some appreciation of that instinctual balance, playing it by ear almost. I don't think you certainly can't use an algorithm to do it. You cannot rely purely on logic and reason. You can't rely on methodologies. You can't rely solely on a kind of algorithmic approach to this. It has to be in the moment, and it has to be an intelligent response. That's how I would frame it. Intelligent in the largest sense of the word.
There's so many things I want to just tease out of that conversation, Chris, because there's a couple of key ideas there. One is the fact that being able to sense and feel your way through that conversation rather than paint by numbers your way through that conversation. And I wanted to ask you, there's two questions that are really coming up for me. The first one is intuition, that sense of emotional intelligence, and the role of that in leadership is obviously very important. And again, how do you cultivate that? Because again, not all of us are naturally great at that, and perhaps that's something we need to cultivate and develop. But the other question that comes up for me is, going back to your time as the interim MD there in the business, where you were able to flexibly change your style from being democratic to autocratic. A lot of people I know, typically their natural style is to be more autocratic. And in today's world, I don't know if it's true or maybe it's just what I'm reading or what I'm hearing. It's almost like the autocratic leader is constantly trying to not be autocratic as well. Is there a place for autocracy in leadership is what I'm asking.
Yeah, and absolutely.
As a primary methodology, like you had to revert to that when your democratic approach didn't fail. But for those leaders whose primary method is autocracy, is there a place for that type of leader?
If it's primarily autocratic and it's stuck in autocratic, then it will be very useful in certain circumstances and highly destructive in others. The key is that one's leadership style has to be very, very fluid and has to be, there's nothing new about this. This is so-called situational leadership. But what's important is that the leader can see that the choice that they have a choice in how they respond. That's the key. And you only get that choice if you are able to detach from your innate kind of leadership preferences. And I think we all have them. But if you're stuck in it, then you're going to run into trouble because you will find yourself in situations where it doesn't work.
I really appreciate that because, again, the person I was referring to earlier that said the greatest risk to his business was himself is quite autocratic in his approach to things. And it's his go-to methodology. And again, your point is so incredibly valid and very timely because what he was feeling was being autocratic style leadership was somehow less than someone whose primary approach or natural tendencies is to more democratic. And I think your point is really right. It's about that situational leadership and it's about being conscious of your own, I guess, go-to methodology and being aware enough in that circumstance or in that particular situation that, hey, this is not working. I'm going to have to try something else. And if it's working, fine. But if it's not, then having that ability to change and be flexible is sounding like the key.
The key is not being identified with a particular style. Yeah. And this is where ego comes in and one's own identity of oneself, which is something that you create over a period of time. The more crystallized it is, the more difficult it is to change or detach oneself from it. And this is where the whole concept of mindset comes into play. And people talk about mindset coaching and changing your mindset and all of this stuff. I tend not to, I am at the moment, but I tend not to use the word mindset because it's almost a self-contradiction. The mind is an incredibly fluid plastic. We talk about neuroplasticity. It's a tremendously fluid faculty that we've got with the mind. It's quite an extraordinary thing. And yet we seem to be intent on setting it, turning it into a solid block of something so that it becomes predictable and deterministic. And it's the antithesis of what the mind really is or what it can be.
It's a really interesting conversation, Chris, and there's so many, again, lots of wonderful threads of conversation. I've got a bazillion things. I could talk to you for days, by the way. But but given it's approaching 12:30 in the evening for you, I won't, I promise. But what's really interesting around this is the concept of ego, the concept of mindset, the concept of being fixed. Here's just, I'm going off the cuff here. I have my notes and research that I do for every guest, and this is not anywhere in my notes and research. But one of my observations around the world in which we live today, and again, I'm perhaps sounding like the grumpy old man in the world, the two Muppets sitting, at the front, the two guys in the Muppet shows, one of those guys. Yeah. But it's really interesting to me that what I've noticed, and again, maybe it's just my reticular activating system noticing these things to reinforce my own beliefs. But what I've noticed is there seems to be a desire for people to oversimplify things, to formulaic, algorithmic approaches to life, business, success, relationships, the 7 simple secrets to having more money, the 7 keys to a great relationship, or whatever it happens to be. And yet what I'm hearing around all of this is the ability to have deep thought, emotional intelligence, trusting one's intuition, all those human characteristics that make us human, rather than an algorithmic approach, paint by numbers, 7 hacks to instant fame kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is that just me noticing that, or are we sometimes trying to oversimplify things that are inherently not simple?
Oh, I think we are. And I think we're trying to pin things down which are uncertain. You may have come across the acronym VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And a lot of our efforts as a society is fighting against that uncertainty, that inherent uncertainty. And funnily enough, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've been presented with more uncertainty than we've ever had before. Certainly,
yes.
for our generations.
Yes.
So we're not suddenly going to get rid of it. And my take on all of this is, rather than fight it, because if you reduce this to the absurd, which is a very useful exercise to do on occasion, if you were to make everything completely certain and deterministic and simple and completely unambiguous, if you knew what was going to happen from moment to moment, I suggest that would be akin to a kind of death. There would be no life in that whatsoever.
No.
If you could get there. Similarly, if you go to the other extreme, complete chaos, that doesn't do much for you either. But there's that beautiful sweet spot in the middle, the Goldilocks zone, if you like, or a little bit like if you think of surfing on the sea. You've got, if far out in the ocean, there's no surf. If you're too close to the beach, you've got broken waves. You can't do anything with that at all. But at the right distance out at sea, where the waves are beginning to form, that's the point at which you can surf and you can have fun and you can live. Yeah. And you'll probably know that better than I am as an Aussie. And of course, that distance depends on all kinds of other elements. So it's different from day to day. Depends on where the tide is. So it's a complete unknown. But without that balance of structure and chaos, you won't have much fun. Good things won't happen. And I think our fight to make everything certain actually kills us a little bit in the process.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And I think it leads to disappointment as well, because trying to find a simple solution to a complex problem doesn't always solve the problem, and so we feel a sense of disappointment if we're not getting those outcomes. But they said there was 3 easy steps. And why have I not got my Ferrari in the garage? Because I did this, and this. They said, and again, I'm being ridiculous and engaging in a bit of hyperbole, but the point remains that it leads to disappointment if we're not achieving the outcomes, because we're seeking oversimplistic solutions to complex problems that require deep thought.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the other key aspect of this is that there is this pathological focus on outcome and result rather than on the process that leads to it. Now, if you extrapolate that out to the biggest possible scale for an individual, we're talking about life. Now, what is the outcome of life?
Death, basically.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, what's the rush? Let's forget about the outcome. Let's focus on the process.
Yes.
And if we could do that more in leadership roles, more in our day-to-day lives, we would have a hell of a lot more fun. We might not achieve as much in terms of some of the amazing technology that we have. We might not get there as quickly, but my God, we might not have some of the mental health problems that we've got as a result.
100%. The fulfillment piece would be there, wouldn't it? And this goes back to your pottery metaphor as well, is knowing when to push and when to constrain a bit as well.
Yeah.
And I think, without, as I said, as you said earlier, that every metaphor has its limits. So I don't want to kind of overplay it. But at the same time, there is that lovely balance to be had in terms of, being, forward-focused, seeking to achieve a particular outcome, but also, as you say, focusing on that process and enjoying it. And if you don't hit your goal, within the time frame, does that really matter? And can we reset that for a different time frame and just enjoy that journey a bit more? And look, I can tell you with two hands in the air, Chris, that I have been guilty of in the past in my life, setting goals, working feverishly to get there, and perhaps sacrificing a bit of quality of life along the way. And by the time you achieve the goal, you think, what did I give up really to achieve that? And I think there's that balance between success and fulfillment.
Absolutely. I mean, a great example of this, unfortunately, is in the world of sport, particularly kind of elite athletics, where mental health issues are pretty severe. Not for everyone, but they're certainly higher than in the general population. Because, if you're an Olympic athlete, you spend 4 years preparing for that one moment that might last 10 seconds or whatever it is. And as one Olympic finalist said, it's almost easier to come second than to win gold, because if you win gold, there's a moment of elation and then this sense of now what? And it's summit syndrome. Essentially, that's how you would label it.
It's really interesting. I've got a daughter who's a competitive gymnast, I should say. And I think as well, some things that don't serve in that space are perfectionism. That intense focus on perfectionism is really an unhealthy thing. And, we've had to work pretty hard with her to keep some perspective about that. And but left unchecked, it could be very, very detrimental. Chris, you're also the author of a book called The Broken CEO, and the tagline to that book is How to Be the Leader You've Always Wanted to Be. I wanted to ask you, it takes a bit of time to write a book, I get that, and it takes a lot of effort and probably late nights. What was the impetus to writing that book, and what was the key message that you really wanted to convey to your reader?
The impetus was, I just had an urge to articulate what I'd learned, both in my career, my kind of corporate career as a leader in various guises, and as a coach and developer of other leaders, to crystallize it and have a kind of repository of knowledge or wisdom or whatever you want to call it that other people could tuck into. And it worked well. It actually didn't take me that long. It took me 4 weeks to write. So I was clearly ready to do it.
Yeah.
The key points, the overriding one is the principle of looking within oneself for the answers to the problems that present themselves outside oneself. Our experience of life is, if we care to sit back and reflect carefully and look at what is actually happening, our experience of life is experienced within ourselves. It's not actually out there at all. The out there is a complete illusion that all the great philosophers, poets, sages and seers have been speaking about since the dawn of time. I mean, the good news is that we've got far more control over the way that we think and feel than we do over what's going on out in the world. I don't know if you've ever tried to change somebody's mind over an opinion. It's quite difficult, if not impossible. Yep. If you're at loggerheads with someone because of a difference of opinion, it's far easier to rise above it by allowing yourself to let go of this urge to change someone else's mind. I mean, basically, how they think is their responsibility and none of your business. That's what it boils down to. Yep. And yet we feel this sometimes very strong urge to go in and change the way other people think. I think, a long-winded answer, but it's about turning inwards and looking at our inner dynamics as the levers for change in the outside world.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Your point about how we do that inner work, how we understand that, I guess the inner game or the mental game that we operate with every single day, whatever our own internal operating system is going to determine how we experience life, how we experience everything, really. And of course, it's also going to be really important, as you said earlier, about how we interact with other people, how we experience them, how they experience us. And that affects the quality of not just the quality of our work, the quality of our relationships. our own mental well-being. So there's a lot of really good things about being conscious and present and being aware of all those things. So I'm really grateful to you for sharing that. Ladies and gents, if you want to grab a copy of the book, the title of the book again is called The Broken CEO, and the subheading or tagline is called How to Be the Leader You Always Wanted to Be. You can grab that at Amazon. So go ahead and grab that. I'd really encourage you to do that, because I think, again, if you want to develop yourself as a leader, it really begins with developing yourself before you can develop others. And leadership starts with oneself.
Yeah. Very, very, very true. And, even if you're a hermit with no relationships at all, you still have your own life to lead.
Yes.
It's in the language, isn't it? You lead a life.
Yeah. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us. It's now approaching, goodness knows, 1 o'clock in the morning. You've been incredibly generous to sit up this late and to talk to us, but not only that, to share some really useful, thought-provoking, practical strategies to become more effective in our roles as leaders. For those people that want to find out more about you and your work, you can head across to clarityspace.co.uk. And can people find you on the socials, Chris? Where would people be best to find you?
You certainly get me on LinkedIn. I'm not on Facebook, but LinkedIn. And I also have a site called chrispearse.co.uk. And that's Pearse with an S.
I'm sure there's an origin story right there.
Yeah, it's Irish, I suspect, if you go back long enough.
Okay, there you go. Chris Pearse with an S, all the way just near Oxford. Really appreciate you taking the time, as I said, to come and talk to us. You've been incredibly insightful, thought-provoking and wonderful guest, and I really am grateful to you for sharing today.
Well, likewise, Jesse, it's been a great pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast. For more episodes, go to drjessegreen.com/savvydentist. And to discover how to build a high-performance dental practice, visit drjessegreen.com and download the free report.